Take any unwanted bride. The judge laughed. Then the giant cowboy pointed to the black girl in chains. The courthouse roared with cruel laughter, chains rattling as frightened women stood in a row. Dust swirled through the open doors, the church bell tolling noon. Everyone expected her fate to be misery until one towering cowboy stepped forward. In a single breath, he chose her, not just to save her from shame, but to bind his life to hers. But what no one knew was that this so-called unwanted bride carried a secret more powerful than bullets or the law itself. A hidden deed to the one thing every rancher, railroad man, and lawman in town would kill to control. Now, in a land where prejudice runs deeper than the wells, this unlikely pair must fight for justice, for survival and, maybe even for love. When a black woman claims the spring that could change the whole frontier, will the town destroy them? Both. Or can their courage turn chains into freedom? Your reactions remind me why these stories matter. If you still believe in the quiet power of love, justice, and truth, then you're part of the reason I keep sharing them. The late afternoon. Sun blazed through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. Sweat trickled down faces in the packed room as Judge Hollis Crane's mocking voice cut through the heavy air. He stood at his bench, a vulture in black robes, gesturing at the line of women chained before him. Gentlemen of Cedar Springs. The judge drawled, his lips curling into a cruel smile. Feast your eyes on today's offering of unwanted brides. His gavel tapped a lazy rhythm against the wooden block. Any man willing to take one of these vagrants off our hands will be doing the town treasury a favor. Ava Johnson stood straight-backed among the prisoners, her chin raised despite the iron shackles that bit into her wrists. The rough hemp of her jail dress couldn't hide her natural dignity, even as jeers and catcalls echoed through the stuffy courtroom. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her fear. "Look here," Judge Crane continued, pointing his gavel at Ava. "This one can read and write, or so she claims. Quite the accomplishment for A." He paused, letting the unspoken slur hang in the air. Several men in the crowd snickered. The floorboards creaked, and a hush fell over the room. Heavy footfalls drew every eye to the courthouse entrance. There, ducking his head to clear the doorframe, stood Caleb Boone, his massive frame filled. The doorway and the afternoon light caught the silver at his temples. Trailed dust coated his clothes, and his gun belt had seen better days. But there was no mistaking the quiet strength in his bearing. Whispers rustled through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Boone, the mountain man. What's he doing in town? The giant cowboy moved forward with deliberate steps, each boot heel striking the floor with purpose. His face remained impassive as he approached the front of the courtroom. But his eyes, sharp and clear as mountain water, fixed on Ava. She met his gaze, trying to read the intention behind it. Judge Crane's smile widened, showing tobacco-stained teeth. Well, well. Caleb Boone graces us with his presence. Come to find yourself a bride, have you? Without speaking, Caleb raised one weathered hand and pointed directly at Ava. The crowd's reaction was immediate. Gasps and mutters of shock rippled through the benches. Someone near the back let out a strangled laugh of disbelief. The judge's amusement grew even more pronounced. Her. He threw back his head and laughed, the sound sharp and ugly in the tense room. Surely you jest, Boone? There are other choices more. He waved his hand vaguely. Suitable. Caleb's expression didn't change. He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small metal disc, a sheriff's marriage token. The afternoon light caught its brass surface as he held it up. The token was legitimate, and everyone knew it. Even Judge Crane couldn't ignore it. Ava's breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. She'd never exchanged more than a few words with Caleb Boone during her time working for the merchant family. He'd always been polite, nothing more. The judge's laughter faded to a scowl. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a threatening growl. "You understand what you're doing, Boone?" Caleb stepped closer to Ava. Though he towered over her, his presence felt more protective than threatening. He bent slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's the only way to save you." The words were simple, but they carried the weight. Of truth, Ava looked up into his face, searching for any sign of mockery or ulterior motive. She found only steady resolve in his eyes. After a long moment, she gave a small nod. "Very well," Judge Crane spat, clearly disappointed at being unable to prevent the marriage. "Deputy, remove her shackles." The chains fell away from Ava's wrists, leaving angry red marks on her skin. The ceremony, if it could be called that, was brutally short. Judge Crane rushed through the words as if they burned his tongue. The courthouse had grown deathly quiet, the earlier jeers replaced by scandalized silence. Every face showed some mixture of shock, disgust, or morbid fascination. When it was done, Caleb offered his arm to Ava. The gesture was so courtly, so at odds with his rough appearance, that she almost smiled despite her fear and confusion. She placed her hand lightly on his forearm, feeling the solid muscle beneath his sleeve. Together, they walked down the center aisle. The crowd parted before them like water around a stone. Ava held her head high, though she could feel the hostile stares burning into her back. Caleb's stride never faltered. They reached the courthouse doors, and Caleb pushed them open. The late afternoon sun hit them like a physical force, momentarily blinding after the relative dimness of the courtroom. Ava blinked rapidly, her eyes adjusting to the glare that turned the dusty street to gold. As they stood on the courthouse steps, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. She was free, no longer a prisoner facing an uncertain fate. But she was also married to a man she barely knew, a silent giant who lived alone in the mountains. She didn't know whether to feel grateful or terrified. The courthouse door slammed behind them with a final sounding boom, cutting off the murmurs of the crowd inside. In the distance, a church bell tolled 4 times, marking the hour in a town that would never be the same after this day. The setting sun painted the Colorado sky in shades of amber and purple as Caleb led Ava to his waiting wagon. The wooden vehicle sat at the edge of town, loaded with supplies and hitched to 2 sturdy bay horses. Dust from the day's heat still hung in the air, making the sunset even more dramatic. Caleb's massive hands were surprisingly gentle as he helped Ava climb onto the wagon seat. The boards creaked beneath them as he settled beside her, taking up the reins with practiced ease. A light snap set the horses in motion, and the wheels began their steady turn away from Cedar Springs. The road stretched before them like a pale ribbon in the fading light. Ava sat with her back straight as a fence post, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Every few minutes, she would steal a glance at the giant beside her. Caleb kept his eyes forward, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. The only sounds were the steady clip-clop of hooves, the grinding of wheels against dirt, and the occasional creak of leather harness. The silence felt heavy between them, filled with unasked questions. After they'd traveled about a mile, Caleb reached into his saddlebag without taking his eyes from the road. He pulled out a cloth-wrapped package and offered it to Ava. "Bread and jerky," he said, his voice low and rough from disuse. "You must be hungry." Ava hesitated, eyeing the package. Her stomach clenched with emptiness. The jail's meager rations had barely kept her alive. Pride warred with need for a moment before need won out. She took the package with slightly trembling fingers. "Thank you," she whispered. The bread was crusty but fresh, and the jerky was better than anything she'd had in weeks. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, aware of how her body craved the nourishment. Caleb seemed content to let her eat in peace, his attention on guiding the wagon around the deeper ruts in the road. The scrubland rolled past them, dotted with patches of sage and scattered pinyon pines. The last rays of sunlight caught the tips of the distant mountains, making them glow like burning coal. As darkness began to settle over the land, Ava gathered her courage. "Mr. Boone," she said softly, then corrected herself. "Caleb, there's something you should know." She paused, watching his profile carefully. "I can read and write. The judge wasn't lying about that. And I have something important. A letter from my former employer, Mr. Harrison." Caleb's hands tightened slightly on the reins, but he didn't speak. Encouraged by his attention, Ava continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Before he died, Mr. Harrison gave me a deed. It grants me ownership of a spring just outside of town." The wagon lurched as Caleb's hands jerked involuntarily on the reins. The horses snorted in protest, and he quickly steadied them. His head turned sharply to look at her, eyes wide with disbelief. "In the gathering dusk, the spring in Cottonwood Canyon?" he asked, his voice tense. Ava nodded, her heart beating faster at his reaction. "Yes. Mr. Harrison said it was payment for my years of service and protection for my future." Caleb's breathing had grown heavy. He looked back at the road, his jaw working as if chewing over her words. "That spring," he said finally, "is what the railroad men and the ranchers have been fighting over these past 6 months. Both sides claim they have rights to it." "Then they're both wrong," Ava said firmly, though her hands trembled slightly in her lap. "The deed is legal and proper. Mr. Harrison made sure of that before he died." "Keep it secret," Caleb warned, his voice urgent but gentle. "If either side knows you have the deed, you'll be in more danger than you were in that jail." Ava lifted her chin, something of her old fire returning to her eyes. "The truth needs to be known. That spring is rightfully mine, and I won't hide from what's right." Caleb fell silent again, but the quality of his silence had changed. Was respect in it now, mixed with concern? The darkness had fully settled around them. The first stars were appearing in the velvet sky. They traveled a bit further before Caleb guided the wagon off the main road, following a smaller trail that led to a creek. The sound of running water mixed with the evening songs of crickets and the distant call of a whippoorwill. "We'll camp here tonight," Caleb said, bringing the wagon to a stop in a small clearing. "It's too dark to travel safely in the mountain roads." He helped Ava down from the wagon, then moved with quiet efficiency to make camp. Soon a small fire crackled cheerfully, pushing back the darkness and taking the edge off the night's growing chill. Caleb brought his bedroll from the wagon and, without ceremony, handed it to Ava. "Take this," he said. "I'll sleep fine without it." Ava accepted the blanket, touched by the gesture. "Thank you," she said softly, wrapping it around her shoulders. The wool was rough but warm, carrying the scent of horse and leather and open air. They sat on opposite sides of the fire, the flames casting flickering shadows on their faces. The silence between them was different now, still tense with all that remained unsaid, but threaded with something else. A fragile trust was taking root like a tender shoot pushing through hard soil. Caleb added another stick to the fire, sending sparks swirling up toward the stars. Ava watched him through the flames. This quiet giant who had saved her from the jail only to learn she might need saving from something far more dangerous. He caught her looking and held her gaze for a moment before turning away. They settled down to sleep. Ava wrapped in Caleb's blanket. Caleb propped against his saddle with his hat pulled low. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the concerns of those below. Both lay awake for a long time, minds turning over the events of the day and wondering what the dawn would bring. Dawn painted the eastern sky in delicate, strokes of pink and gold as Caleb and Ava prepared to leave their campsite. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of sage and pine from the distant mountains. Dew sparkled on the grass like scattered diamonds. Slowly evaporating in the growing light, Caleb hitched the horses with practiced efficiency while Ava folded his blanket, her movements stiff from sleeping on the hard ground. The iron marks on her wrists were still visible, angry reminders of the jail's chains. She winced as she climbed back onto the wagon seat, but kept her head high. The wagon creaked into motion. Following a narrow trail that wound steadily upward into the foothills, Ava found herself forgetting the discomfort as she took in the landscape around them. Massive peaks rose in the distance, their snow-capped summits gleaming in the morning sun. Closer at hand, pine forests clothed the slopes in deep green, broken by meadows bright with late summer wildflowers. "It's beautiful," she breathed, unable to keep silent before such grandeur. Caleb glanced at her, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Gets prettier the higher we go," he said softly. The trail grew steeper, forcing the horses to strain against their harnesses. Caleb handled the reins with gentle skill, never pushing the animals too hard. They were about 2 hours into their journey when the sound of approaching horses made them both tense. 2 riders appeared around a bend, pushing their mounts at a dangerous pace down the rocky trail. Ava recognized them as townsmen from Cedar Springs. The shorter one owned the general store, while his companion often lounged outside the saloon. Both men pulled their horses up short when they saw the wagon. The storekeeper's face twisted into an ugly sneer as his gaze fell on Ava. His companion spat into the dust beside the wagon wheel. "Won't last," he muttered, loud enough to carry. Caleb's jaw tightened, the muscles standing out like rope under his skin. His massive hands gripped the reins harder, but he kept his eyes forward and said nothing. The 2 men exchanged knowing looks before spurring their horses onward, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. Ava sat very still until they were gone, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had expected such reactions, but the reality still stung. To her surprise, she felt Caleb's quiet anger beside her more keenly than her own hurt. The sun climbed higher as they continued their journey. Near midday, Caleb guided the wagon off the trail into a meadow bordered by aspen trees. Their leaves shimmered silver green in the light breeze, creating a dappled shade perfect for resting the horses. "Need to check on Maple," Caleb said, nodding toward his offside mare. "She favors that left foreleg sometimes." Before he could climb down, Ava was already moving. "Let me help," she said firmly. "I know horses." Caleb looked surprised but didn't object. He watched as Ava approached Maple with quiet confidence, speaking softly to the mare while running gentle hands down her leg. The horse's ears pricked forward, responding to her touch. "There's heat in the tendon," Ava murmured, probing carefully. "Not too bad, but she needs rest." She looked up at Caleb. "Mr. Harrison bred horses. I helped care for them." Something shifted in Caleb's expression. Respect, maybe even admiration. He nodded and brought out the water bucket, letting Ava help tend to both horses before they continued their journey. The afternoon wore on as they climbed higher into the mountains. Shadows were long and purple when they finally crested a ridge, revealing a small valley below. Caleb's ranch house stood against the western hills, weathered gray in the fading light. It was a solid building, 2 stories tall with a front porch that needed mending. A barn leaned slightly to one side, and the corral fence showed signs of harsh winters. But it was the silence that struck Ava most deeply. No neighbors in sight, no smoke from other chimneys, just the vast emptiness of the mountains. Caleb helped her down from the wagon, then led the way up creaking porch steps to the front door. Inside, the house felt hollow with loneliness. Dust lay thick on every surface, and cobwebs decorated the corners like tattered lace. The furniture was sparse but sturdy: a table, some chairs, a sideboard with copper pots hanging above it. "Kitchen's through here," Caleb said gruffly, moving to clear some tools from the table. "Bedroom's upstairs. It's small, but it's yours." He paused, looking uncomfortable. "Haven't had much cause to keep things tidy." Ava set down her small bundle, everything she owned in the world, and looked around the kitchen. Despite the dust and disorder, she could see the bones of a good home. The stove was solid iron, the windows large enough to let in plenty of light. A pump by the sink promised fresh water. "I'll need a lamp," she said practically, already reaching for a dust rag. Caleb brought her a kerosene lamp and matches, then disappeared outside to tend to the horses. By the time he returned, Ava had cleared the table, swept the worst of the dust away, and had beans simmering on the stove. The lamp cast a warm glow in the gathering darkness, making the kitchen feel almost cozy. They ate their simple supper in silence, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. Caleb watched. As Ava served the beans, something like wonder in his eyes at this small touch of domesticity. "Thank you," he said softly when she filled his bowl. "Been a while since I had a proper cooked meal." Ava nodded, accepting his thanks with quiet dignity. After they finished eating, she climbed the narrow stairs to the bedroom, carrying the lamp. The room was indeed small, with a narrow bed and a chest of drawers. But it was clean now. She'd seen to that while the beans cooked. She unpacked her few possessions: a spare dress, worn Bible, a packet of letters tied with faded ribbon, and most precious of all, the deed to the spring, carefully wrapped in oilcloth. Each item found its place in the drawer, marking the beginning of something new. The lamp's flame wavered as she set it on the windowsill. Outside, stars were appearing in the darkening sky, bright and clear in the mountain air. Ava stood for a long moment, looking out at the silent valley, feeling the weight of all that had changed in just 2 days. Below, she could hear Caleb moving quietly through the house, banking the stove for the night. A new chapter was beginning for both of them, here in this lonely house beneath the stars. Whatever came next, she was determined to face it with the same strength that had brought her this far. Dawn broke over the mountain valley, painting the sky in streaks of pink and gold. Ava woke to birdsong filtering through the small bedroom window. For a moment, she lay still, remembering where she was, no longer in a jail cell, but in a real bed, beneath a roof she could almost call her own. She dressed quickly in the cool morning air and made her way downstairs. The kitchen stood silent and empty. Through the window, she could see Caleb already out by the barn, his tall figure moving among the animals. Determination straightened her spine as she surveyed the work. Ahead, first, she found an old broom in the corner and began sweeping, raising clouds of dust that had settled into every crevice. The wooden floors, though worn, gleamed with rich color once cleaned. Near the window, a faded curtain hung torn and limp. Ava found needle and thread in her small sewing kit and settled onto a chair, working quickly to mend the fabric. The familiar motions of domesticity steadied her hands and heart. In the pantry, she discovered a sack of flour still good enough for baking. Soon, the kitchen filled with the warm scent of biscuits rising in the old iron stove. She had just pulled them out, golden brown and steaming, when Caleb's heavy boots sounded on the porch. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes widening at the transformed room. Sunlight streamed through the mended curtain, catching dust motes in its beam. The swept floors and fresh-baked biscuits spoke of care that had long been absent from his home. "Didn't expect," he began, then fell silent, clearly unsure how to continue. "Breakfast is ready," Ava said simply, setting a plate before him. Caleb took a tentative bite of a biscuit, and surprise flickered across his weathered face. "These are good," he said softly, as if the words had escaped without permission. After breakfast, they worked together on the ranch's endless tasks. Caleb showed her where the fence needed mending, and Ava proved herself handy with hammer and nails. They moved among the cattle and horses, checking for signs of illness or injury. Ava's gentle touch calmed even the most skittish animals. Throughout the morning, Ava noticed how Caleb kept glancing her way, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. The stark loneliness of the place felt less oppressive with two people. Sharing the work, their movements falling into an easy rhythm. As afternoon approached, Caleb saddled his horse. "Need to ride over to Mason's place?" he explained, checking his saddlebags. "We're short on some supplies." He hesitated before adding, "Will you be all right here alone?" Ava nodded, touched by his concern, but determined to show her capability. "I will tend to things," she assured him. "The fire needs feeding, and there is more cleaning to be done." After Caleb rode away, Ava continued her exploration of the house. The main floor had yielded its secrets, but the loft remained a mystery. She climbed the narrow stairs, ducking under low beams until she reached the dusty space above. Boxes and trunks lay scattered about, covered in years of neglect. In one corner, she found a small chest containing what must be Caleb's personal belongings. A Bible lay on top, its leather cover worn smooth with handling. Opening it carefully, she found his name written in a steady hand: Caleb James Boone, 18th Infantry Regiment. Throughout the pages, penciled notes filled the margins. Some were simple observations about camp life or battle movements, but others revealed deeper struggles. Next to Psalm 23, he had written, "How can He restore my soul when I have seen such darkness?" The words made Ava's heart ache, offering a glimpse into the wounds Caleb carried. Beneath his quiet exterior, the sun was lowering toward the mountains when hoofbeats announced Caleb's return. Ava hurried downstairs to find him unloading supplies, his shoulders rigid with tension. He moved stiffly, as if carrying an invisible burden, over a simple supper of beans and the remaining biscuits. Caleb finally spoke. "Town's already talking," he said, his voice low and troubled. Words spread about. He paused, searching for words. "About me," Ava finished quietly. "A black woman living on white land." Caleb nodded, his jaw tight. "And about the spring. Some are saying it ain't right. You haven't claimed to such valuable water rights." He looked down at his plate. "Could be trouble coming." Silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken fears. Ava felt the weight of generations of prejudice pressing down, threatening to crush this fragile new beginning. But her mother had taught her that music could lift the heaviest heart, almost without conscious thought. She began to hum a hymn her mother had sung in their kitchen back in Ohio. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. The melody rose soft and clear in the quiet room, filling the space between them with something gentler than fear. Caleb's hands stilled on his fork. He sat motionless, listening as the familiar tune wrapped around them both. Though he didn't join in, something in his face softened, as if the music had touched a place long closed off to comfort. When the last note faded, neither spoke for a long moment. Outside, a whip-poor-will called in the gathering. Dusk. The homestead felt different now, no longer just a place of solitude and work, but somewhere that might, with time and care, become truly alive again. Caleb finally stirred, clearing his throat. "My mother used to sing that," he said roughly, the words seeming to surprise even him. It was the first time he had mentioned his family, and though he said nothing more, Ava understood the gift of that small confidence. They finished their meal in a silence that felt almost peaceful, despite the shadows gathering outside. The hymn's echo lingered in the air between them. It's a reminder that even in uncertain times, grace could still find its way into the hardest places. 2 days passed like a gentle stream, each hour washing away a little more of the initial awkwardness. Between Caleb and Ava, On the morning of the third day, Caleb stood in the doorway of the kitchen, his broad shoulders filling the frame. "We need supplies," he announced, his voice firm but gentle. "Can't put off going to town forever." Faye's hands stilled over the dough she was kneading. "Some might say we should." "Let them talk," Caleb replied, though his jaw tightened. "Hiding only makes folks suspect worse." The wagon creaked under their weight as they set out, the morning sun casting long shadows across the trail. Ava sat straight-backed beside Caleb, her cotton dress freshly pressed despite its wear. She had tied her hair back neat and proper, determined to face whatever waited in town with dignity. The closer they got to Main Street, the more Ava could feel eyes turning their way. Whispers followed them like autumn leaves in the wind. Ladies pulled their children closer. Men stopped their conversations to stare. On the church steps, Preacher Matthews stood with his Bible clutched to his chest. As their wagon passed, his voice carried clear and sharp across the morning air. "Lord, save us from unnatural unions that mock his divine plan." Caleb's hands tightened on the reins, but Ava touched his arm lightly. "Let him waste his breath," she said softly. "We know what's in our hearts." At Henderson's General Store, the bell above the door announced their entry. Like a warning, the usual bustle of commerce stuttered to a halt. Mrs. Henderson's face pinched as if she'd bitten into something sour, while her husband suddenly became very interested in reorganizing already neat shelves. Ava moved through the store with deliberate grace, selecting what they needed. She ran her fingers over bolts of fabric, choosing a sturdy cotton in a soft blue shade. Into their basket went beans, coffee, and lamp oil. Her movements were unhurried, as natural as if she'd been shopping there all her life. From the corner of her eye, she noticed Mrs. Abigail Harlan, the town's widow and midwife, watching her. Unlike the others, Mrs. Harlan's face held no judgment, only a quiet understanding. As Ava passed near her, the older woman offered a small but genuine smile of encouragement. That tiny gesture of kindness warmed Ava's heart. But the peace was short-lived. Outside the store, 3 ranch hands lounged against the hitching post. Ava recognized them as workers from the Barrett. Spread the largest ranch that depended on the contested spring. "Well, if it ain't the bride thief," the tallest one drawled as Caleb emerged carrying their supplies. "Reckon you thought you was mighty clever, Boone, stealing yourself a wife just to spite decent folk." Caleb's massive frame went rigid. His fists clenched at his sides, and Ava could see the muscle working in his jaw. The ranch hands shifted uneasily, clearly not having expected Caleb to be quite so imposing up close. But before Caleb could respond, Ava stepped forward. Her voice rang out clear and steady in the sudden quiet of the street. "I am his wife," she declared, lifting her chin. "And I have papers to prove my right to the spring." The men recoiled as if she'd struck them. Around them, people who'd been pretending not to watch now openly stared. The sound of her voice, educated, confident, and free, seemed to unsettle them even more than her presence. "You're lying." One of the hands sputtered, but uncertainty had crept into his tone. "The deed is registered with the territorial office," Ava continued calmly. "Any man can check the records himself." A crowd had gathered now, drawn by the confrontation. Ava could see her words spreading through them like ripples in a pond. The shocking news that not only had Caleb Boone married a black woman, but she held legal claim to the most valuable water source in the county. Caleb touched her elbow. Gently. "Time to go home," he murmured. They loaded their supplies while the crowd dispersed in small clusters, heads bent together in urgent conversation. Ava could almost see the news racing through town, spreading from mouth to mouth like wildfire in dry grass. The ride home was tense with unspoken worry. The sun was sinking toward the mountains when they finally turned onto the trail to their ranch. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop in the yard, but neither of them moved to unload. "Those men you face down," he said at last, his voice rough with concern. "They work for Barrett. He's been trying to claim that spring for years." He turned to look at her directly. "Your declaration today, it set fire under powerful enemies." Ava met his gaze steadily. "I reckon a truth ain't worth much if you're afraid to speak it." In the gathering dusk, she saw something like admiration flash across his weathered face. But his words remained grave. "Barrett won't take this lying down. He's got money and influence with the territorial judge." "Then we'll face whatever comes," Ava replied simply. Together. The word hung between them in the deepening twilight, a promise neither had expected to make, yet somehow felt right as summer rain. The evening wrapped around the cabin like a thick quilt, bringing with it a heavy silence. Inside, the rhythmic scrape of Caleb's whetstone against steel punctuated the quiet. He sat near the hearth, methodically sharpening his tools, his massive frame casting long shadows on the wall. Every so often, his eyes would drift to Ava, who perched in the room's only rocking chair, her nimble fingers working a needle through the worn fabric of his old work shirts. Neither spoke of the day's confrontation in town. Its weight pressed down on them like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The flame in the oil lamp flickered, making the shadows dance as Ava tied off another neat stitch. She could feel the tension in Caleb's shoulders from across the room, read it in the extra force he applied to the whetstone. When morning came, Ava stood at the cabin door, studying the patch of earth near the water barrel. The soil looked rich enough, despite the late season. She waited until Caleb returned from feeding the horses before speaking her mind. "We ought to plant some beans," she said, gesturing to the empty plot. "There's still time before first frost, and we'll need the food come winter." Caleb paused, doubt crossing his weathered face. "Mighty late in the season for planting. My mama taught me about late beans," Ava replied. "They're hardy if you tend them right." And with 2 pairs of hands, she let the words trail off, meeting his eyes. After a long moment, Caleb nodded. "Reckon we could try?" They worked side by side under the morning sun, Caleb turning the soil while Ava marked out careful rows. The physical labor seemed to loosen something in both of them, and stories began to flow as naturally as the creek. "Behind the cabin, 1863, Caleb said quietly, pausing to wipe his brow. "That's when I joined up with the Union. Weren't much older than a boy, really." His voice grew distant. "Saw things no man should have to see." Ava planted another bean seed before responding. "I was working in Mr. Harrison's house then. He was a merchant, treated me fair. Taught me my letters." She smoothed soil over the seed with gentle fingers. "When he passed, his son sold everything. That's how I ended up out here." The afternoon wore on, their shared labor building a bridge between their separate pasts. When the last row was planted, they stood back to survey their work, dirt still, clinging to their hands. That evening, as they sat down to a simple supper of cornbread and stew, Caleb cleared his throat. "Do you pray, Ava?" His voice was soft, almost shy. A warm smile touched Ava's lips. "Every day of my life. Faith carried me through the jail cell, through the mockery in that courthouse." She met his gaze across the table. "It'll carry us through whatever gossip those townfolk can muster." The crash came just as they were clearing the dishes. Glass shattered inward as a rock the size of a man's fist smashed through the window, sending fragments skittering across the floor. Ava let out a startled cry, and Caleb was on his feet in an instant. Moving to shield her dot in the sudden silence that followed, they could hear hoofbeats retreating into the night. Caleb approached the rock carefully, noting the paper tied around it with twine. His hands shook slightly as he unwrapped it, holding it close to the lamp to read. "Leave by Sunday, or hang." Ava's legs trembled, and she gripped the back of a chair to steady herself. The sudden violence of the attack made the threat feel terrifyingly real. But when Caleb turned to her, his face was set with quiet determination. He crossed the room in 2 long strides and took her hands in his. They were warm and strong, steadying her. "They'll not drive us out," he promised, his voice low but firm. "Not while I draw breath." They worked together to clean up the broken glass and board over the window. Neither slept much that night, taking turns keeping watch. Though no more trouble came, the sun had barely cleared the mountains the next morning when they heard a wagon approaching. Caleb grabbed his rifle, but through the window. They recognized Mrs. Harlan's faded blue bonnet. The widow had driven her cart well off the main road, coming in through the back pasture to avoid being seen. Her normally calm face was etched with cute worry as she hurried up to the cabin. "I had to come," she said in a hushed voice once they'd ushered her inside. Words spreading about the spring claim. The railroad meant there behind these threats. They've been pressing Barrett and the other ranchers, saying if they don't run you off, the rail line might choose a different route altogether. Caleb offered her a chair and a cup of coffee, which she accepted gratefully. "Much obliged for the warning, Mrs. Harlan." "It's not right," the widow continued, her hands tight around the coffee cup. "The way they're treating you both. My Herbert, God rest him, always said a person's character matters more than their color." Ava laid a gentle hand on the older woman's shoulder. "We won't bow to fear, Mrs. Harlan, but your kindness means more than you know." After Mrs. Harlan left, taking a roundabout way back to town, Ava and Caleb stood together on the cabin's porch. The morning sun painted the mountains gold, but the beauty couldn't quite mask the tension in the air. "They'll try something else," Caleb said quietly. "Men like that always do." Ava nodded, her spine straight as a rail. "Then we'll face it. Together." They spent the rest of the morning reinforcing the cabin's windows and checking the locks on the doors. Every so often, they would pause in their work to scan the horizon, watching for dust clouds that might signal approaching riders. But for now, the land stretched peaceful and empty around them, offering no hints of the storm they both knew was brewing. The Sunday morning dawned clear and crisp, with autumn's first breath cooling the mountain air. Ava stood before the small mirror in her bedroom, smoothing down the simple brown dress she had carefully stitched over the past week. Her fingers traced the neat seams, each stitch a testament to her determination to appear dignified despite the threats hanging over them. Caleb's heavy footsteps crossed the cabin floor. "We should leave soon," he called through the door, his voice carrying an edge of concern. When Ava emerged, she found him in his best shirt, freshly pressed, though his weathered boots betrayed his daily labor. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of her dress. "You did fine work there," he said quietly. "Reckon we ought to show them our best," Ava replied. Lifting her chin, the wagon ride to town stretched longer than usual, each clip-clop of the horses' hooves bringing them closer to confrontation. Ava held the Bible in her lap, her mother's favorite psalm marked with a pressed flower. Caleb drove with purpose, his massive frame straight as an oak. As they approached the white-painted church, heads turned. Women gathering on the steps fell silent. Men paused in their conversations, some spitting into the dust. But Caleb's towering presence beside Ava seemed to dare anyone to speak openly against them. The wooden steps creaked under Caleb's weight as he helped Ava down from the wagon. She took his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles, and together they walked toward the church door. Whispers followed like autumn leaves skittering across wooden boards. "The audacity in God's house that spring belongs to inside." The morning light filtered through simple glass windows, casting rainbow patterns on the worn pews. Ava and Caleb chose a bench near the back, though Caleb's height made him visible regardless. Mrs. Harlan, seated across the aisle, offered a subtle nod of encouragement. Reverend Matthews ascended the pulpit, his black coat stark against the whitewashed wall. His sermon began innocently enough, speaking of God's natural order. But soon his words took a darker turn. The Lord set boundaries between peoples, he intoned, his eyes sweeping the congregation. When men defy these divine separations, when they claim what is not rightfully theirs, they invite God's curse upon the land. His gaze settled pointedly on Ava and Caleb. Unnatural unions and cursed springs bring only strife to God-fearing communities. Ava sat straight-backed, her hands folded quietly in her lap. Beside her, Caleb's jaw tightened, but he remained still. The congregation shifted uncomfortably, some nodding in agreement, others staring at their boots. When the time came for hymns, the Reverend announced Amazing Grace. The organist began the familiar notes, but before anyone could stand, Ava rose. Alone. Her voice, clear as morning light, filled the church. Amazing Grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. For a moment, she sang alone, her voice carrying to every corner of the sanctuary. Then, from the widow's pew, Mrs. Harlan's voice joined hers. A child's sweet soprano followed, then another. Slowly, more voices rose, not all, but enough to make the hymn swell with genuine praise. Caleb remained silent, but his presence beside her felt like a mountain's strength. Some of the ranchers and their wives refused to sing, their glares sharp as winter wind. But others seemed touched by the simple beauty of shared worship. After the final amen, Mrs. Harlan hurried to catch them before they left. "Your voice is a gift," she whispered to Ava, pressing her hand. "Don't let anyone silence it." But Reverend Matthews intercepted them at the door, his face stern. "Brother Boone," he said, his voice low but carrying, "God will not bless this arrangement. For your soul's sake, reconsider your path." Caleb's shadow fell across the preacher's face. "Reckon God's blessing ain't yours to withhold, Reverend." His quiet words carried the weight of steel. The ride home felt lighter somehow, despite the morning's tension. As the wagon rolled past the creek bend, Ava reached over and briefly clasped Caleb's rough hand. "Thank you," she whispered, "for standing beside me." Caleb struggled visibly with words, his throat working. Finally, he squeezed her hand in return, the gesture speaking volumes in a silence. The afternoon brought unexpected visitors. First came the Miller family, their young daughter clutching a paper-wrapped package of fresh flour. "For your baking," Mrs. Miller said simply, not meeting their eyes, but nodding respectfully as the sun began its descent behind the mountains. Old Jim Carson rode up, leading a pack mule. Without ceremony, he unloaded several boxes of candles and matches. "Winter's coming," he said gruffly. "Folks need light." More neighbors followed, each bringing small offerings, dried apples, cornmeal, even a jar of honey. None stayed long. But their quiet support carried more weight than grand gestures. Each gift represented a choice, a small defiance against those who would drive Ava and Caleb out. As evening settled over the cabin, Ava lit one of the new candles and placed it in the window. Its flame burned steady, a beacon of hope in the gathering darkness. The threat wasn't gone. They could feel it still, lurking in the shadows of their future. But today had shown them they weren't entirely alone. Caleb stood at the window, watching the candle's reflection. "Never thought I'd see the day," he murmured, "when this cabin felt like more than just shelter." Ava moved to stand beside him, their shoulders nearly touching. Outside, crickets began their evening song, and somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called. The mountain air carried the scent of pine and promise. Despite the challenges that surely lay ahead, the morning brought a brittle chill, frost glazing the grass like sugar. Ava woke before sunrise, her breath visible in the cold bedroom. She pulled her shawl tight and hurried to restart the banked fire in the hearth. The familiar task kept her hands busy while her mind wandered to Caleb. Already out working with the horses since dawn. The cabin felt different now, no longer a stranger's home, but a place where she belonged. Her touches showed in the swept floors, the dried herbs hanging from rafters, the neat stack of patched quilts. Even the windows sparkled, cleaned of years of dust. As she worked the fire back to life, she heard Caleb's heavy footsteps on the porch returning for his midday meal. But another sound made her pause, hoofbeats approaching. More than one rider. Through the window, she saw 3 men on horseback coming up the trail. Her heart stuttered when she recognized Sheriff Lathrop's badge glinting in the wan sunlight. Caleb must have heard them too. He stepped away from the barn, standing tall. As the riders approached, Ava moved to the doorway, gripping the rough wood frame. "Boone," the sheriff called out, his voice carrying false cheer. "Got some business with you." 2 deputies flanked him, hands resting to casually near their gun belts. One was young, barely more than a boy, avoiding everyone's eyes. The other, weather-beaten and hard-faced, sneered openly at Ava. "What business?" Caleb asked, his deep voice steady. Sheriff Lathrop dismounted, boots crunching on the frosted ground. "Seems there's some question about ownership of your horses." He pulled papers from his vest. "Got bills of sale here, saying they belong to the railroad company." "That's a lie," Caleb said flatly. "I raised most of these horses myself." The others. "I bought fare from Carson's spread 2 years back." The sheriff's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Papers say different." "And papers don't lie, do they?" He glanced meaningfully at Ava. "Unlike some folks around here, making claims about springs they've no right to." Ava stepped forward. "Those papers are forged. Anyone can see. Stay out of this," the older deputy snapped, moving his horse between her and the men. The sheriff pulled out iron manacles. "Caleb Boone, you're under arrest for horse theft. We'll sort this out in town." "You can't," Ava protested, trying to push past the deputy's horse. "He's innocent." The younger deputy, at least, had the grace to look uncomfortable. As Sheriff Lathrop approached Caleb with the chains. For a moment, Ava thought Caleb might resist, his massive frame tensed, fists clenching. But then he looked at her, and something in his eyes made her understand. Fighting now would only make things worse. "It's all right, Ava," he said quietly. As the sheriff bound his wrists, "Truth will come out." The older deputy roughly grabbed Caleb's arm, shoving him toward the waiting wagon. Ava tried to follow, but the other deputy blocked her path. "Best stay put, woman," the sheriff warned. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." They loaded Caleb into the wagon like cargo. The chains clinked against the wooden bed, the sound piercing Ava's heart. She watched helplessly as they turned the wagon around, heading back toward town. As the wagon disappeared around the bend, Ava's knees gave way. She fell to the dirt, her hands digging into the frozen earth. Fury and fear warred in her chest, making it hard to breathe. She wanted to scream, to run after them, to shake sense into the sheriff. Instead, she forced herself to stand, though her legs shook. The rest of the day passed in a blur of necessary tasks. The animals still needed feeding, water needed hauling. The fire needed tending. Each chore felt heavier without Caleb's presence. The cabin's silence pressed against her like a physical weight. As night fell, Ava sat alone by the hearth, the fire's warmth failing to reach the cold pit in her stomach. She pulled out the spring deed, its creased paper almost memorized by now. The lamplight flickered across the careful script. The official seal, the signature of her former employer, all proving her rightful claim to the water source the railroad coveted. "Lord, give me strength," she whispered, touching the paper gently. "Show me the way forward." She thought of Caleb in a jail cell, suffering because he dared to help her. because he'd chosen to stand beside a black woman claiming her rights. The thought burned like coal in her chest. Sleep proved elusive. She moved through the dark cabin like a ghost, straightening things already straight, checking the windows, adding wood to the fire. Every creak of the settling house made her start. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Finally, exhausted, she curled up in Caleb's chair by the fire, wrapping herself in one of her newly mended quilts. The familiar scents of leather and pine still clung to the chair's fabric, bringing fresh aches to her heart. When dawn finally broke, painting the frost covered windows with pale light, Ava forced herself to move. She pulled on her warmest shawl and headed out to feed the animals. The horses nickered at her approach, expecting Caleb's familiar hand. She stroked their velvet noses, whispering softly to them. "We'll get him back," she promised, more to herself than the horses. Whatever it takes, each step through the morning. Chores felt like walking through deep water, but she pushed herself forward. She couldn't allow herself to collapse. Not now, when Caleb needed her most. The spring deed sat heavy in her pocket, a reminder of what they were fighting for. Her determination began to harden like iron in a forge. They thought to break her by taking Caleb, thought she'd run scared or give up her claim, but they didn't. Know the strength that had carried her through chains before. They didn't understand the power of a woman fighting for what was right. The loneliness ached fierce and raw. But she turned that pain into purpose. She would find a way to free Caleb. She would protect the spring that was rightfully hers. And she would show this town that neither chains nor threats could break her spirit. The autumn morning dawned clear but cold as Ava saddled Caleb's lame mare. The horse, Pearl, stood patient while Ava carefully checked the cinch, just as Caleb had taught her. Her hands trembled slightly as she mounted, both from worry and the biting morning air. "Easy now," she murmured to Pearl, patting the mare's neck. The horse's slight limp meant they would travel slowly, but Ava preferred it that way. It gave her time to gather her courage for what lay ahead in town. The sun climbed higher as they made their way down from the foothills. Pearl's hooves crunched through frost-covered grass, her breath visible in small clouds. Ava kept one hand on the reins, and the other pressed against the spring deed in her pocket, drawing strength from its presence. Main Street was busy when they arrived, wagons and riders moving through the morning bustle. Heads turned as Ava rode past. Some folks stopped talking mid-sentence, while others whispered behind raised hands. She held her spine straight, refusing to shrink under their stares. The jail sat squat and gray at the end of the street, its barred windows like angry eyes. Ava tied Pearl carefully to the hitching post, checking the knot twice. Taking a deep breath, she climbed the wooden steps and pushed open the heavy door. Sheriff Lathrop lounged behind his desk, boots propped up on the scarred wood. His eyes narrowed when he saw her. "I want to see my husband," Ava said firmly, her voice stronger. Then she felt. The sheriff's chair creaked as he leaned forward. "Now why would I allow that? It's my right. He's been falsely accused." Rights. Sheriff Lathrop laughed, a harsh sound. "Ain't you learned yet about claiming rights that don't belong to you?" Two deputies entered from the back room, smirking at the exchange. The older one, gray-haired and weather-beaten, spoke loudly as if she weren't there. "Railroad men sure are pleased having Boone locked up," said he was becoming a real problem, standing in the way of progress. "Out of the way now, ain't he?" The younger deputy added with a snicker. Ava's hands clenched into fists, fury rising in her throat. But she forced herself to stay calm, knowing an outburst would only make things worse for Caleb. "I'll be back," she said quietly, meeting the sheriff's mocking gaze. "Every day until you let me see him." She turned and walked out, her skirts brushing the rough floorboards. Outside, she leaned against Pearl's warm shoulder for a moment. fighting back tears of frustration. The walk to Mrs. Harlan's house helped settle her nerves. The widow answered her knock quickly, ushering her inside with worried eyes. "They wouldn't let me see him," Ava explained. Accepting a cup of tea with shaking hands, Mrs. Harlan's kitchen was warm and smelled of fresh bread. "You can't stay alone." "At that ranch," she said firmly, "it's not safe." "I have room here. I can't leave," Ava interrupted. "That land is as much mine now as it is Caleb's. If I run, they win." The older woman sighed but nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Then, at least let me send my boy up sometimes to check on you." "Thank you," Ava said softly, touched by the offer. The ride home seemed longer. Pearl's steady gait, marking time with Ava's troubled thoughts. The sun was lowering toward the mountains when movement near the trail caught her eye. An elderly native woman stood waiting, her silver hair bound in neat braids. Her bearing dignified despite well-worn clothes. Pearl stopped without Ava's guidance. The woman approached slowly, her dark eyes keen and knowing. "I am Nahava," she said, her voice rich with age and wisdom. "I have watched you these past days, sister who claims the spring." Ava's breath caught. "You know about the spring?" Nahava nodded, gesturing to the distant foothills. "My people tended those waters long before white settlers came. We shared them, freely, as the Creator intended." She reached into a leather pouch at her waist. "I have kept the old documents, the agreements made before broken promises poisoned the land." Hope bloomed suddenly in Ava's chest. Documents that prove the spring should be shared. That the railroad can't claim it? Yes. Nahava's weathered hand touched Ava's arm gently. "I will show you, teach you the spring's true story. Together we can protect what belongs to all." Tears spilled down Ava's cheeks, weeks of fear and loneliness cracking her careful control. "Thank you," she whispered. "I was starting to lose faith." "Faith grows stronger when shared," Nahava said softly. "Come to my camp tomorrow. We will begin." The sun had set by the time Ava reached the ranch. She tended to Pearl carefully, making sure the mare had fresh hay and water. The cabin's darkness seemed heavier than ever as she lit the lamp and built up the fire. Sitting in Caleb's chair, she pulled out her Bible, its pages soft with use. Her fingers found the worn cover, tracing the letters blindly as she bowed her head. "Lord," she whispered into the quiet room, "protect him in that jail. Give me strength to fight for what's right. And please," her voice broke slightly, "bring him home safe to me." The cabin creaked and settled around her, its emptiness a physical ache. But for the first time since Caleb's arrest, hope flickered alongside her fear. Tomorrow she would meet with Nahava. Tomorrow they would begin building. A case that not even the railroad could ignore. Outside, a coyote called lonely across the hills. Ava clutched the Bible closer and prayed again, softly but with growing determination. For Caleb's safe return, dawn painted the mountains gold when Ava heard hoofbeats approaching the cabin. She stepped onto the porch, shielding her eyes against the rising sun. Nahava rode slowly up the path on a sturdy paint pony, her silver braids catching the morning light. 2 leather pouches hung from her saddle horn. "Welcome," Ava called, hurrying down the steps. Her heart beat faster at the sight of those precious pouches. Nahava dismounted with careful grace, her movements deliberate but strong despite her years. "The morning brings hope," she said, touching Ava's arm in greeting. "Are you ready to learn the spring story?" They settled at the rough-hewn table inside. Ava served coffee while Nahava spread out yellowed documents and brittle scrolls with reverent hands. Some were government papers with official seals. Others were drawings on cured hides showing the spring's location marked with traditional symbols. "Here," Nahava pointed to a document dated 1837, "the first agreement between my people and the white traders." See how it speaks of sharing the water? Ava leaned closer, reading carefully. The formal language was clear. The spring was designated as a common water source, protected for use by all who lived in the valley. And this one, she touched A. Later documents bearing both English script and unfamiliar symbols. The peace treaty of 1854, Ahava's finger, traced the tribal markings. Our chiefs insisted the spring remain free for all people. The government men agreed. See their signatures here? Hours passed as they studied each piece of evidence. Ava took careful notes, her handwriting growing more confident as understanding bloomed. These agreements were binding. They proved the railroad had no right to claim the spring. The truth has weight, Nahava said, watching Ava write. But it needs strong voices to speak it. Ava nodded, determination settling in her chest like iron. I'll speak it. For Caleb, for you, for everyone who needs that water. After Nahava left, Ava spent the afternoon crafting her testimony. She wrote and rewrote, choosing words that even the most hostile judge would have to hear. The lamp burned low as she worked, her shadow stretching across the cabin floor. When the sun began to set, she saddled Pearl. The mare's limp was better. Today, as if she too sensed the importance of their mission. The ride into town was quiet, with only the whisper of wind through autumn dry grass. Mrs. Harlan's house glowed with lamplight. Ava tied Pearl beside the widow's own horse and knocked. Softly, the door opened quickly. Come in, Mrs. Harlan whispered. The others are waiting. In the snug parlor, Ava found 5 women gathered Mrs. Peterson, who had lost her farm to the railroad. Mrs. Collins, whose well had run dry last summer, the Cooper sisters, who ran the millinery shop, and young Sarah Miller, whose husband worked. Laying track? Show us, Mrs. Harlan said, and Ava spread out copies of the documents she had made. The women bent close. Reading by lamplight, Mrs. Peterson's hands trembled as she touched the papers. These could save more than just your spring, she said. They could protect all our water rights. That's why we must stand together, Ava replied. Will you come to court with me? Show the judge that this matters to everyone. One by one, they nodded, even Sarah Miller, though her face was pale with worry. They'll be angry, Mrs. Collins warned. The railroad men, the land speculators, they won't take this lying down. I know. Ava's voice was steady. But we have truth on our side, and numbers if we stand together. They talked late into the evening, planning how to gather more support. When Ava finally rode home, stars wheeled overhead in the vast Colorado sky. Pearl's hoofbeats echoed in the darkness, a lonely sound. The cabin felt emptier than ever. Ava lit the lamp and warmed beans left from morning. Without thinking, she set 2 plates on the table. The second one sat empty, a habit she couldn't break. She could almost see Caleb there, his huge frame bent over his plate, his quiet presence filling the room. I miss you, she whispered to the empty chair, but I'm fighting for us both. After washing up, she changed into her nightdress and knelt beside the bed. The floorboards were hard against her knees, but she barely noticed. Lord, she prayed. Softly, give Caleb strength in that jail. Keep his spirit whole. Her voice caught. And Lord, give me courage for what's coming. Not just to free him, but to face those who hate us. Help me stand straight and speak true, no matter how they Look at me. She climbed into bed, pulling Caleb's quilt up to her chin. Outside, a nightbird called, high and lonely. Ava closed her eyes, holding tight to hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but she wasn't alone anymore. She had truth in those documents, allies in those women, and faith burning bright as the stars above the mountains. The lamp flickered low as she drifted toward sleep, her mind full of tomorrow's battles. But her heart was steadier now, strengthened by purpose and the promise of justice. The morning sun blazed through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. 2 days had passed since Ava gathered her allies, and now the benches creaked under the weight of townsfolk packed shoulder to shoulder. The air hung thick with tension and the musty smell of old wood. Ava's heart thundered in her chest as she walked through the heavy doors. Mrs. Harlan stayed close on her right, while Nahava's dignified presence steadied her left. Behind them came Sarah Miller, the Cooper sisters, and several other townspeople who had chosen to stand with truth. Their footsteps echoed in unison across the floorboards. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Ladies clutched their fans tighter, and men shifted uncomfortably in their seats. No one had expected such a show of unity, least of all from women of different stations and races walking together. Judge Crane sat high on his bench, his usual smirk firmly in place. His gavel cracked against wood, silencing the whispers. "Bring in the prisoner," he commanded. 2 deputies led Caleb into the courtroom. Despite 3 days in jail, he stood straight and tall, though his clothes were dusty and his face unshaven. His eyes found Ava's immediately, warming with pride at the sight of her brave stance. "Caleb Boone," Judge Crane drawled, consulting a paper with exaggerated care. "Charged with theft of 4 horses, property of the Western Pacific Railroad Company. How do you plead?" Before Caleb could answer, Ava stepped forward. Her voice shook slightly, but grew stronger with each word. "Your Honor, I have evidence that proves these charges false." The judge's face darkened. "You have no standing in this court, woman." "I am his wife," Ava declared, her chin lifting. "And I have documents that speak to more than just these false charges." Murmurs rose from the gallery. Ava reached into her satchel, drawing out first her deed, then Nahava's carefully preserved scrolls. The papers rustled in her trembling hands, but her voice rang clear as she began to read. "This spring, marked here on the original survey, was deeded not just to me, but designated since 1837 as a water source for all people of this valley." She held up one of Nahava's scrolls. "These tribal agreements, signed by government agents, prove it was never for sale to any railroad." Judge Crane scoffed, his face reddening. "Those papers mean nothing. This is a hearing about horse theft, not water rights. The charges are connected." "Your Honor," Mrs. Harlan spoke up from beside Ava. "The railroad men want Mr. Boone's land for that spring. When they couldn't buy him out, they fabricated these charges." The gallery erupted in voices. Some shouted support, others protested angrily. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, but the noise only grew. Suddenly, the courthouse doors burst open. A crowd of ranchers and townspeople pushed inside, led by gruff old Mr. Peterson and 3 of Caleb's nearest neighbors. They were weather-beaten men who rarely came to town, but today they stood shoulder to shoulder, faces set with determination. "We've worked beside Caleb Boone for years," Mr. Peterson called out. "He's no thief. This is railroad trickery, pure and simple." The deputies shifted uneasily, hands moving toward their guns. But they were badly outnumbered by the surge of townspeople now filling the courtroom. The air crackled with tension. Judge Crane's face had gone from red to purple. "Order, I will have order." But the crowd pressed forward. Someone shouted, "Free him." The cry was taken up by others until it filled the room. The deputies looked to the judge, who seemed to shrink in his high seat in the confusion. Mr. Peterson and 2 other men strode to where Caleb stood. The deputies, seeing the mood of the crowd, stepped back. Without ceremony, Mr. Peterson produced a key he'd, somehow, obtained and unlocked Caleb's shackles. They fell to the floor with a clang that seemed to echo through the sudden quiet. Caleb rubbed his wrists, then walked straight to where Ava stood. His huge hand engulfed hers, their fingers intertwining naturally. The simple gesture spoke volumes. Here stood husband and wife, bound by choice and conviction. Not just necessity. Judge Crane's gavel cracked one final time. "This hearing is suspended," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I will review these documents and issue a formal ruling tomorrow morning." The crowd began to move, breaking into clusters of excited conversation. Some faces showed clear support, others uncertainty or lingering hostility. But no one could deny the power of what they'd witnessed, a community choosing justice over prejudice. Truth over corruption. Ava and Caleb walked out together, his arm protective around her shoulders. Mrs. Harlan and Nahava followed, along with their other supporters. The morning sun seemed brighter now, gilding the dusty street with promise. Behind them, the courthouse buzzed like an overturned hive. As townsfolk argued about water rights, railroad power, and the meaning of justice. Tomorrow would bring the judge's ruling, but today had already seen a victory, not just for Caleb and Ava, but for all who dared to stand against injustice. The wagon wheels creaked softly as Caleb guided the horses home through the deepening dusk. Beside him, Ava sat with her back straight, though exhaustion lined her face. The day's victory in court had drained them both, leaving a quiet contentment in its wake. Crickets chirped in the tall grass, and a cool evening breeze carried the sweet scent of late summer flowers. When they reached the ranch, Caleb helped Ava down from the wagon, his large hands gentle at her waist. The familiar sight of their cabin, with its weathered logs and thin curl of smoke from the chimney, brought comfort after the tension of the courthouse. Inside, Ava moved to the stove while Caleb lit the lamp, its warm glow softening the shadows. Neither spoke as she warmed the leftover stew and sliced fresh bread. The routine of setting out plates and cups felt different tonight, more permanent somehow, more like home. They sat across from each other at the rough wooden table, the lamplight playing across their faces. Steam rose from their bowls as they ate, the silence comfortable between them. Caleb's spoon scraped against his bowl, and he cleared his throat softly. "What you did today," he began, his deep voice hushed. Standing up to the judge, bringing those folks together, he paused, struggling to find the right words. "Your courage gave me strength in that jail cell. Every night, I'd think of your faith, how you never gave up." Ava looked up, meeting his eyes. A gentle smile touched her lips, though worry still creased her brow. "We'll need that strength again tomorrow," she said softly. "The railroad men won't take defeat easily." Caleb nodded, understanding in his weathered face. They finished their meal in companionable quiet, the cricket song drifting through the open window. Morning came clear and bright, the sun casting long shadows across the yard as they prepared for another ride to town. Ava wore her best dress, the one she'd carefully mended, while Caleb had managed to press his shirt despite his large fingers. They hitched the horses with practiced efficiency, working together as if they'd done it for years instead of weeks. The courthouse square was already crowded when they arrived, townsfolk pressing close to the building's wooden steps. Whispers followed them as they made their way inside, some hostile, others curious or even supportive. Mrs. Harlan appeared at Ava's elbow, giving her hand a quick squeeze of encouragement. The courtroom benches groaned under the weight of what seemed like half the town. Nahava sat dignified in the front row, her dark eyes steady on the judge's bench. Railroad men clustered near the front, their expensive coats marking them apart from the local ranchers and farmers. Judge Crane entered, his face set in hard lines. The room fell silent as he took his seat, shuffling through the papers before him with deliberate slowness. When he finally spoke, his voice carried barely contained anger. "Having reviewed the documents presented yesterday," he began, each word seeming to cost him, "this court finds the deed held by Mrs. Ava Boone to be valid and binding." He paused as murmurs rippled through the crowd. "Furthermore, the tribal Records provided by Mrs. Nahava establish historical precedent for shared access to the spring in question. The railroad men shifted angrily in their seats, but the judge continued. Therefore, the court rules that the Western Pacific Railroad Company has no exclusive claim to the water rights of said spring. The property shall remain as deeded, with traditional access preserved. Though his tone was bitter, the law had spoken. Ava's hand found Caleb's, their fingers intertwining tightly. Around them, the crowd erupted in mixed reactions, some shouting in protest, others nodding in satisfaction. As people began filing out of the courthouse, a clear, small voice rose above the din. A young girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, had begun to hum the hymn Ava had sung that Sunday in church. The sound carried, pure and sweet, through the angry mutters, one by one. Other voices joined in, first Mrs. Harlan, then several of the women who had stood with Ava. The melody swelled, picked up by more townspeople until it seemed to fill the square. Even some who had opposed them found themselves humming along, the familiar tune bridging divisions that had seemed impossible to cross. Caleb's arm slipped protectively around Ava's shoulders as they walked through the crowd. His massive presence and her quiet dignity made them a living symbol of defiance and hope, proof that love could overcome prejudice, that justice could prevail against greed. The ride home felt lighter than the journey into town. The afternoon sun warmed their backs, and Ava found herself humming softly, the hymn still echoing in her heart. Caleb glanced at her, a rare smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. That evening, as shadows lengthened across their yard, they worked together to bring in the horses and close up for the night. Inside the cabin, Caleb built up the hearth fire, while Ava prepared a simple supper. The flames cast dancing light across the walls, making the space feel warm and alive. Over their meal, Caleb told a story about his childhood that made Ava laugh, a real laugh, free and unguarded. The sound surprised them both, and soon Caleb joined in, his deep chuckle mixing with her lighter tones. It was their first true shared laughter, sweet and healing after all the tension they'd endured. They sat together by the fire afterward, watching the flames dance and sharing comfortable silence. The victory was theirs, but more than that, they had found something neither expected, a partnership built on respect, faith, and growing affection. The lamplight glowed soft on their faces. Two people who had begun as strangers now bound together by choice and conviction, their future stretching out before them like a promise. The week after their court victory brought changes as gentle as the autumn breeze. Each morning, Ava and Caleb rose with the sun, sharing quiet breakfast before tackling the day's work. The cabin, once cold and empty, slowly transformed under their careful attention. Neighbors began appearing at odd hours, driving wagons loaded with gifts. Mrs. Peterson brought a sack of flour and fresh ground cornmeal. The Wilson boys carried wooden planks and tools for mending the broken window. Even Mr. Thompson, who had once turned away at their approach in town, drove up with seed, corn, and garden tools, his eyes downcast but his words sincere. "Reckon you showed us all something about doing right," he mumbled, handing Ava a bundle of dried herbs for planting. Caleb worked steadily, his large hands surprisingly delicate as he fitted new glass into the window frame. Ava knelt in the soft earth beside the cabin door, creating a small herb garden. The scent of fresh-turned soil mixed with the mountain air as she planted rosemary, thyme, and sage. In the evenings, they sat by lamplight, their shadows dancing on the walls. Words came easier now, like water breaking through a dam. Caleb spoke of the war, of friends lost and faith shattered. Hadn't said a proper prayer since Gettysburg. He admitted one night, his voice rough, "Till I saw you standing in that church, singing like you knew God was listening. Made me remember what believing felt like. Ava touched his hand gently. "I never thought I'd find peace in these mountains," she said. Now I can't imagine being anywhere else." Together, they began weaving dreams into plans. The spring would flow freely, they decided, with a path cleared for all who needed water. The cabin could shelter those in need, widows, orphans, travelers seeking rest. They sketched out ideas for a longer table, big enough for many to gather round. "We could build a proper garden come spring," Caleb suggested, watching Ava stir the evening stew. "Maybe raise some sheep, not just cattle." Ava nodded, smiling. "And teach the children to read," she added. "Every child should know their letters." Each shared word, each quiet touch, each moment working side by side strengthened the bond between them. What had begun as desperate refuge had grown into something neither had expected, to find a love built on respect, faith, and shared purpose. The mountain air turned crisp as evening settled over the ranch. Golden lamplight spilled from the cabin windows, casting warm rectangles onto the packed earth outside. Inside, Ava moved with practiced grace around the kitchen, the familiar scents of cornbread and stew filling the air. The door creaked open as Caleb ducked through, bringing the cool evening air with him. His boots were damp from his work at the spring, but satisfaction showed in his tired smile. "Water's flowing clear and strong into town," he reported, hanging his hat on its peg. "Even old Thompson's boy came to fill their barrels today." I nodded, setting 2 steaming bowls on the table. The lamplight caught the silver threading through her dark hair, now neatly pinned back. They sat together, the quiet comfort of routine settling around them like a warm blanket. Caleb reached across the weathered table, his large hand engulfing Ava's smaller one. "That day in court," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion, "I didn't take an unwanted bride. I found the one I needed most." Tears welled in Ava's eyes, catching the lamplight. "And I found home," she whispered back. They stepped out onto the porch together, into a night bright with stars. Along the trail, lantern light bobbed as neighbors approached through the darkness. Mrs. Harlan led the way, carrying her famous apple pie. Behind her came the Wilsons and Thompsons, bearing baskets and warm greetings. Someone started humming the hymn Ava had first sung in church. Other voices joined in, the harmony rising sweet and clear on the mountain wind. In the distance, the spring burbled its endless song of new beginnings. Caleb drew Ava close as they stood watching their gathered neighbors, their hearts finally at peace. The hymn swelled around them, a testament to faith, love, and the power of chosen family. Thanks for watching. Stories like this shape us in ways we don't always expect. If something resonated, subscribe. I'm back tomorrow with another one worth hearing.